Hi, I'm Malika Bilal.
And I'm Omar Badar, and you're in the stream.
You've probably seen your fair share of U.S. election and UK referendum coverage, but there's another vote that's flying under the radar. Australians are heading to the polls this weekend, having already had 4 prime ministers in as many years.
That's right, Malika. You know, that political instability is making a lot of people less excited and less engaged with the election. People right here like Anjali on Facebook who says, as a young voter, you tend to feel disengaged because of the political instability within the 2 major sides. The past 5 years have shown that neither of the parties have been able to stand behind one leader. Now, speaking of Facebook comments, we are live streaming this show right now on Facebook Live. You can visit it by going to facebook.com/AJStream. And any comments that you put under the live stream over there, I'm going to try to get into the show.
For some Australians, the main candidates on offer aren't doing much to change how voters feel about the election. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's Liberal National Coalition is seen to be offering little more than maintaining the status quo, while Bill Shorten, the leader of the opposition, has also failed to energize voters. Both have been accused of lacking on policy specifics and charisma. But voter disillusionment hasn't stopped the campaign ads from flowing. Here's one from Prime Minister's Liberal Party warning voters against supporting other parties.
If your local vote is for Labor, Greens or an independent, that's a vote for hung parliament chaos, a budget black hole, Shorten's big taxes, less jobs and more votes. Be sure, vote Liberal.
Authorised T-Nut, Liberal Party, Canberra.
Now, of course, others would disagree with that. Here's an attack ad on the Prime Minister by Labour. That's the country's largest opposition party.
Malcolm Turnball is seriously out of touch. Having never relied on these services, Malcolm Turnball made a choice to cut $80 billion from health and education and privatise Medicare. When it comes to your family, Malcolm Turnball is seriously out of touch.
Authorised by G-Right ALP Canberra.
So which of these messages, if any, ring true? Well, to help us answer that, we're joined from Melbourne by Jonathan Brown, an LGBT advocate and media educator. Amy Gray is a writer and activist who supports the Labour Party. Mohammed Ilaisi is a comedian, community worker, and a former Green Party candidate who now supports the Liberal Party. And from Byron Bay, we're joined by Lewis Edwards, a freelance journalist who is voting for the Green Party in this year's election. Welcome to the stream, everyone. Now, Lewis, you saw those campaign ads. They seem to lay out quite the fight. But based on an article you wrote not too long ago, it's on my laptop here, 2016, the most boring Australian election ever? Is it fair to say that you are not convinced?
Yeah, it's just been a very slow electoral cycle, and I think the actual reason the election's been slow has been a deliberate strategy by the Liberal Party. They've gone for a sort of strategy of keep it slow and, you know, just keep hammering the election campaign. And, you know, 8 weeks ago, I was very, you know, into the election. I was campaigning against the Liberals for the Greens. But over 8 weeks, you know, life takes over and your sort of responsibilities take over. And I think everyone in Australia is getting very election weary and kind of just, yeah, the Liberals have kind of won by a sort of strategy of slow attrition. I think they will win tomorrow, very likely. And that's what all the media is saying in Australia. And I think it's through a very interesting strategy of not, you know, selecting any major battles, just winning through, yeah, wearing everyone out, essentially.
Amy, slow. Liberals will probably win through just the battle of attrition. What do you make of that?
There's a really interesting thing that happens in Australian politics where everyone says that they're the underdog. And this is incredibly true when it comes to the election. So you've got some reports saying that the ALP may win according to, you know, recent surveys, but then at the same time, it pretty much looks like a done deal for the Liberals. As it is, I think we have pretty much a weary electorates who just really don't care.
Yep. Speaking of not caring, Malika, we did a show just a couple of days ago about the U.S. election and what people thought of it around the world. We actually got some thoughts from people from Australia who were making a comparison between their election and the U.S. one. Blair over here says, our election coverage has a modicum of sanity attached to it, albeit rather boring. I'm grateful ours isn't as protracted as the U.S. one. And then we have M. Rusiano over here in Australia who tweeted out a poll to her followers asking which election are you more interested in, be honest. And 2/3 of the people who responded to her poll said they were more interested in the U.S. election than Australia's. Mohammed, is that reflected in your surrounding? Do you see people less excited about the election?
I think people are less excited, but that's a good thing. It shows that there's been so much stability over the last few years and that people are generally quite happy. And we're grateful that we don't have a Donald Trump-like character here. Both our politicians or our leaders of the Labor Party and the Liberal Party have been very respectful and dignified in their approach during this election, and they've debated their policies quite well. And I think we've been very lucky that there hasn't been any sort of inflammatory comments or crazy policies or anything like that. I think it's just been what an election should be, which is kind of relatively sane and normal.
So you don't have a Donald Trump, but you might have a Frank Underwood, and so that is a character from the popular Netflix drama in the U.S. here, House of Cards. I want to show you a tweet here and why I'm bringing that up, why it's relevant. Malcolm Turnball, the current prime minister, tweeted in March threatening to call an election, the election that we are now coming up to, and House of Cards, about this diabolical couple that are scheming to get the White House. The official Twitter account writes back, "I admire your methodology, Prime Minister. If you don't like how the table is set, turn over the table." Jonathan, what do you make of this? Calling for an election. You've had 4 prime ministers, really 5 if you count Kevin Rudd, who's been in there twice in the past 4 or 5 years. What do you make of the instability?
Well, really what we have is 2 major parties that are having an identity crisis. So throughout these last 9 years where we've not had a prime minister complete a full term, the parties just don't know what to do with themselves. So on the Conservative side, you have now this socially progressive prime minister who's leading quite a socially conservative party. And he's had to make a lot of concessions to be able to get into power, which has really impacted why people liked him in the first place in the general public. People don't really believe him anymore. And then on the Labor side of things, you have Bill Shorten, the opposition leader, who played a major role in removing 2 Labor prime ministers here in Australia. And so really both parties are in a terrible place where Australians don't really know what to believe from them anymore. So I think that's where a lot of this instability comes from. And from Mohammed's perspective before of things being quite stable, I'd say it's been the exact opposite. We've seen jumping from policy to policy from both parties, and they've really both been scrambling to find out what Australians actually want.
Amy's nodding her head there.
I really actually agree with Jonathan there, and I think that there's actually a large amount of apathy this election season because people actually don't care about the result, because what they've learned from the past couple of years is it doesn't matter all this factionalism, and you do have 2 leaders who are the products of factionalism in Turnball and in Shorten. They just know that if they wait around long enough, it doesn't matter what their vote is, they'll end up being a new prime minister. They'll end up being a complete about face on different policies and things like that. So, people are feeling incredibly disenfranchised with, what seems to be a rote performance of an election campaign.
Speaking of this disillusionment, we have Chio over here who says the election is very stupid. What's the point of voting if at the end your winner candidate is kicked out? Australian elections are a waste of time. He also followed up with a video comment. Check it out.
I'm concerned that my vote is actually a waste of time. We have had 4 prime ministers in Australia since 2013, and all of them elected by the people, but all of them removed by their own party. I think if the people has the power to elect a prime minister, then the people should have the power to remove the prime minister and not the government or the party members.
Louis, do you think there was something anti-democratic about the way all these prime ministers were pushed out?
Yeah, there was an anti-democratic streak to it, but you've got to understand some of the reasoning behind why the prime ministers were kicked out. Julie, in the case of Kevin Rudd the first time around, definitely I would compare Kevin Rudd to someone who's like a boss who is very popular among the general public, but he's horrible to his workers. There were all kinds of stories about how he treated members of the Labor Party. He ran it very harshly and wasn't a very popular man within the Labor Party. we mentioned earlier that Australia doesn't have a Donald Trump. Well, the Prime Minister we had a year ago, Tony Abbott, was essentially kind of like the Australian Donald Trump. Very right-wing and said some very extreme sort of things. And the Liberal Party sort of found itself in a position where they kind of, did have to get rid of him. They wouldn't have been able to survive this electoral cycle without him. So even though it's undemocratic, there has been, I guess, reasons to why both leaders have lost the leadership. There's two leaders especially.
Go ahead, Mohammed.
I don't believe that it is undemocratic, because our system is very different to, say, the US, where we elect our local member of parliament. We don't actually vote directly for the Prime Minister. And those members of parliament are the ones that make the decision to remove the leader or not. And obviously with Kevin Rudd, they did it because he was generally quite, as Lewis mentioned, a pretty bad boss. And with Tony Abbott, yes, there were inflammatory comments that he made, and he was a little bit out of touch with the general population. And as a result, the members of parliament in the Liberal Party rightfully got rid of him, and that's their job.
But at the same time, a vote on an election day in a party, even in a representational manner, still means that it's a vote that has attached to it an expectation of stability. And that stability is not actually getting delivered, to voters. If we have to get up and vote every 4 years, there is some expectation of having stability in the party that they're voting for. And that isn't actually getting delivered to them.
Right.
There's a big difference.
I want to jump in here
well.
because I'm hearing what you guys are talking about with stability and instability, but what I am not hearing about are the issues you are actually wanting to see your politicians address. So I want to show a comment that we got via Facebook Live. This is from an Australian. Peter Kennedy says, "Yes, I'm Australian. The most important thing to me is our immigration policy." And he also says border protection. So Amy, you just kind of sighed there when you saw that. Which of the candidates there, look, Jonathan's also kind of laughing, so I know you guys all have thoughts about this. Which of the candidates do you think are going to address that in the way you see fit?
Look, personally, in the two-party system, neither party is actually going to do anything of meaning or humanity that respects people's human rights. So, from that perspective, no, nothing is going to happen. It's border protection and immigration have been beaten up into completely ridiculous levels of fear-mongering and dishonesty, and it's something that gets peddled again and again by the media and by politicians in lieu of actual, proper, progressive policies in Australia.
On the point of politicians having... Jonathan, I'm actually coming to you with this, but just on the point of politicians being out of touch, we have people who are weighing in on this also. We have Reformed, their ABC here, who says, Canberra's isolation from suburbia is what happens in every government. Every politician, government, prime minister gradually grows out of touch, but never believes it's happening to them the way it did to their predecessors. Do you think this is an inevitable process of people who are basically in power, eventually being in power gets them out of touch?
Yeah, definitely.
I think the problem has to be that our parliament
Lewis
is really
and Jonathan have thoughts on that. Jonathan, you go first, and then Lewis, you jump in.
Well, our parliament is very unrepresentative. If you look at who is standing for election in Australia, one example when it comes to gender equality is that most of the candidates are white men. And that is a consistent theme we've had in Australian politics, where our parliament doesn't actually look like our community and look like our society. So our starting point is terrible. We don't have the diversity within politics that actually represents our people. So of course the community are going to be disillusioned with what they see when they look to their political leaders. They don't look like us and they don't live lives like us.
Lewis?
I think the last, you can definitely look at past political examples. Say John Howard, he started out as someone who was thought of as very representative, normal Australia, had a kind of suburban accountant vibe. And over the years, towards the end of his government, he started pursuing policies that were very out of touch and almost trying to put this American style kind of workplace reform. So I think the gradual years in Canberra does change someone politically. That said, I do think the current Liberal Party members do live a life that are very out of touch. You look at their histories and they've been to elite private schools, then elite universities, and so many of them haven't worked regular jobs. working at a pizza shop, working in a warehouse. So they do live a life where they don't actually understand ordinary concerns.
What about climate change? I want to show you a clip of the current Prime Minister. He wasn't Prime Minister at the time of this, talking about climate change. And there has been some talk online that he's not living up to some previous promises. Have a look at this.
To deal with climate change have been betrayed by a lack of leadership, a political cowardice, the like of which I have never seen in my lifetime before.
Jonathan, of course, this is an attack ad on him, but you were kind of nodding there. You look like you could recognize where that came from.
Well, this is another example of where Turnball has had very different views in the past, and it seems as though to appease the hard right wing of his party, he has taken a complete turn. So this is just another example of where Australians just don't feel that they can trust their leaders. And the same happened with Julia Gillard, who was our Labor Prime Minister, our first female Prime Minister. The same thing happened with her. To appease certain sections of her party, she turned around on issues like gay marriage, which many Australians believed that she was for, but she took a very hardline approach in order to appease certain elements in her party. And we're seeing the same happen here with Malcolm Turnbull on climate change. There's a lot of scepticism about direct action, which is the coalition's plan for climate change here in Australia. A lot of people say that it's just not good enough, and a lot of the experts in climate change just don't believe it really stacks up to what Malcolm Turnbull was talking about just a few years ago.
So, yeah, we actually just got a comment here on Facebook Live. You can take a look at my screen to see it. We have Didi Farag over here who says, important issues for me is that the government to actually be looking out for people instead of telling us what they will actually do to better our country. Instead, all we've heard from each side is how bad the other side and how lacking they are. But on the issues that matter, we also have this tweet here from which is an interesting name. It says, question. 2 people burnt themselves to death in Nauru. Does voting for the Prime Minister that put them there make you complicit? Amy, I want to toss this to you. I know that the issue of asylum seekers is a big deal. Do you think that there is a moral responsibility to make sure that asylum seekers, basically, who are coming to Australia are treated differently? How big of an issue is that in the election?
I think it's actually a rather large issue, and it's one that hasn't really had appropriate coverage or discussion throughout the election campaign. Is there a moral obligation for voters on Saturday when they go to vote, and who they vote for and their complicitness in this whole situation? I actually think that that's an incredibly fair call. We're certainly not seeing the major parties deal with this in any meaningful way, despite regular survey results telling us that the majority of Australians want humane treatment for people who need our assistance.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I want to show everyone a poll. This is the Lowy Institute poll on immigration and refugees of Australians who were polled on the policy, immigration and refugee policy. And you just take a look here. So 63%, I think, would agree with what you were saying, Amy. They agree that stopping the boats, or what are termed boat people, means that Australia can then take in more refugees through the UN processes. But you go down here, 53% disagree that Australia is a wealthy country which should accept more refugees than it does. Slight disconnect there, Mohammed?
Yeah, look, I mean, firstly, just on this issue of refugees, we've had huge issues over the last 10 years, really even 15 years, where we've had quite a number of people drowning at sea. And there's a few things that this government have done that have been incredible, the first of those, which I think they deserve credit for, is getting children out of detention. And, I think a lot of people on the Green side and Labor side have completely ignored that. And the second thing is that now that we have stopped those boats, there absolutely should be a debate in taking in more people through the humanitarian stream. And this government has also brought in an extra 12,000 refugees on top of their current intake from Syria specifically. And again, I think it's a start. I mean, I would like to see a few more, but we need to also acknowledge that there have been more shifts. The detention centres are closing. They've taken a lot of people have been moved out of there. So I think we are making a lot of progress in that debate. Now, the issue is Should we be taking more from the humanitarian stream? Absolutely. I hope that's something that we have a conversation about after the election.
So we have other issues that are...
If I may talk
I
on
think
this
that's an incredibly selective approach. We've had so many cases of human rights abuses in these camps. The media is not allowed to visit the camps to give appropriate monitoring and reporting back to the public. And that's why you see these Lowy results where people are saying, yeah, we do need to accept more people, but then they switch it around and they believe narratives of, well, you know, Australians are hard done by, and, you know, we're Aussie battlers, we really can't pay enough for refugees, or we should actually accept Christians over, you know, people from other religions, because there's a whole set of othering that is happening here. And part of what that is,
I think the whole issue is ridiculous.
There's a lot of culpability
are very supportive of the humanitarian stream. The majority of Australians are absolutely, incredibly supportive of taking in refugees through the humanitarian stream. What Australians are not happy with is what the footage that they see on TV of boats crashing into rocks and people dying, because it's a very uncomfortable thing to see. We have even our immigration stream, which takes in heaps of Muslims. People are generally quite supportive of that.
But there are other issues that are also being raised in this election.
Really
so we have some people who are raising other issues. We have another comment, if you'd like to take a look at my screen, that just came in also from Facebook Live. Stephen Wolf here says that they're looking for better improvement in the lives of Indigenous people. And then there's the issue of gay marriage and LGBT rights. Frames of Context over here says civil rights for segments of a population should never be decided on by votes. You know, we have a referendum coming up about that. It should be rolled over by courts of law. Jonathan, you want to react to that?
Well, when it comes to the plebiscite that's proposed by the Australian government coming up, when it comes to gay marriage, we have a whole section of the community who are having their rights decided by the majority. And we're at real risk of having our lives discussed every day and the validity of our relationships discussed openly and broadly amongst the community. I know during this election campaign, I've already received hate for my sexuality and for my relationship. So how much worse is it going to be when the entire discussion is about me and my relationship? I particularly fear for young LGBTI people who are going to wake up every single morning and find that people are talking about what is wrong and what is right with them and their relationships. And that's a really scary thought, particularly for a political mechanism that isn't actually binding. So if Australia does go to this plebiscite, our politicians won't actually be bound to put this policy through, and it will have to go through a vote of Parliament. And some of our socially conservative members of Parliament have already said that they will ignore what the public says and vote their own way, or in some circumstances, they'll only vote off the basis of just their electorate, which is really just a tricky way of getting out of voting for marriage equality here in Australia. And we're just seeing games played with our rights. That's probably one of the worst parts of it, is they're playing games with us, and we're being used as a political football here in Australia. And in this last week of the election campaign, it's become quite the hot topic between the parties. We now see the Labor Party shifting away from a plebiscite and saying that they will go towards a free vote in Parliament. But to be honest, from a personal perspective, I'm just sick of having the validity of my relationship and the validity of my sexuality discussed every single day. I'm just over it.
I hear that.
And many in the community
I hear that, and I think there are a lot of people online that would agree with you, Jonathan. I also saw Amy there nodding. So that's something we will pick up on in the post show. That's all the time we have for this main show. I want to thank all of our guests. We're taking you over to stream.aljazeera.com. But first, just enough time to get the last word from community.
Comment from Facebook Live as well here on my screen. Nurul Islam says, Australia's election means a change. New faces will come.
All right, more where that came from. See you online. Welcome back. This is the Stream's online post show. We're going to get right back to our discussion. So our guests, between our guests and the community and Omar and I, we threw out about 7 to 10 different issues that Australians are interested in about this election, which is a lot. It's a lot to digest. You were talking very passionately, Jonathan, about wanting to live your life free of the whims of society voting on a plebiscite. The other guests, as Jonathan was talking, Lewis, Amy, Mohammed, can you relate to what he's saying?
Absolutely. This is a basic human right that shouldn't require public debate.
And Lewis?
Definitely. I think government interfering on any issue of personal life choice that doesn't affect others is something fundamentally wrong. People should be able to marry who they want and love who they want.
Lewis, I know you were furrowing your brow there when we were talking about another issue right before we got into marriage equality, because it looked like you really wanted to add something to that discussion. Do you want to go ahead with that?
Yeah, the asylum seeker issue. I think the whole issue of boats is just so blown out. Like, if you actually look at, I do think it's just a very politicised issue. And what you got to understand with Australia's immigration intake is there's 280,000 skilled immigrants coming in a year, compared to around 15,000. I think it's 13,500 is the current intake, refugees. So I think it's this issue that's actually relatively small in the whole scheme of things that parties have blown out to play to people's xenophobias, because most of the people coming, honestly, come from Middle Eastern countries. And I do think the major political parties do use it to play to the xenophobic attitudes of people in certain sections of the Australian community.
I don't think we've heard from Malcolm Turnball anything around, Muslim boat people coming. I think he's been very respectful.
Yeah, but it's implied.
Well, the other issue is, at the end of the day, yes, we should increase the humanitarian intake, and the Greens are saying they want to take in 50,000, which, okay, that's it's an interesting figure. But the question is, what do you do when you've got 50,001? And the Greens haven't responded to that issue of how do you deal with excess, because there will be. I mean, we've got a huge crisis right now internationally, and people are travelling all around the world as they have the freedom to do. But it's got to be done in a way that is manageable. And I do agree, we should increase the humanitarian intake. And I think if we do, Australians will actually warm to that. I don't think Australians have a problem with increasing the intake. What they're worried about is, I think, seeing the boats. And that is obviously a very uncomfortable thing for a lot of people to see on their screens, not just in Australia. It's not unique to Australia. It's anywhere in the world. People see boats arriving, they get very uncomfortable.
I would say there are a few issues alongside that. Okay, yeah, we do have a huge skilled immigration intake, which I think is the issue we're not looking at. There's a lot of young people and people in their 20s sort of underemployed and out of work, and we're not looking at the huge skilled immigration intake. That should be the real immigration issue. And secondly, these immigration centres, they are put in dodgy conditions in places where there's not correct oversight of human rights law, and I think we really do need to look at that, and there hasn't been enough scrutiny on the upholding of human rights and the conditions people are actually held in, because you hear the reports leaking out of them. There's meant to be gag orders on workers working within these centres, but when you hear things coming out, which Tony Abbott even tried to make illegal, when you hear things coming out, the conditions are hellish. They're worse than prisons in a lot of cases.
So Mohammed
and to say that there's no xenophobia.
Amy, Lewis, Jonathan, just want to pause just for a second, because Mohammed mentioned the Greens, and we've heard a lot throughout this conversation of the Liberals and the Labour Party, and so I do want to get the Greens in here. Take a look at this campaign ad for what matters for those who are voting Green when it comes to this election.
What matters to me?
Courage to take on the vested interests.
I want to see our jobs transition into a smarter, cleaner economy.
Tackling inequality.
To see a doctor when I need to.
Freedom.
Recognition of our family.
Protecting our precious places.
Real action on global warming.
We want a party that will show courage and vision.
I want my vote to be powerful.
Together, we're standing up for what matters. This time, vote Greens.
Authorised by Giz Watson for the Australian Greens, Canberra.
So Jonathan, we know where the rest of our guests fall and where they're voting, and I'm not about to ask you where you're voting, but I want to know if this sways you at all, and if you think these are issues that you see the two major parties catering to or addressing at all.
It's an interesting approach because what we've seen is a real lack of internal reform in the Labor and coalition parties. And they haven't really done much in the last few years to really change how the community is represented in their parties. And I can see how for the Greens, this is a really effective strategy. In the inner city elements in Australia, the Greens are really popular because they are committing to these types of policies. The issue with the Greens is whether they can actually deliver on any of those policies. And that's the thing, because they are in this third power position where they may hold some balance of power in our Senate or have a key vote if we end up with a hung parliament in our lower house. They may have some sway, but they have an ability to put out policies that will never actually happen, like no other party can. So that's the sad side of the Greens, is they can put out stuff that sounds nice, but their ability to actually deliver is quite diminished unless they can find some common ground with the Liberal Party or the Labor Party.
And I'm sure Lewis has something to say about that, but we're out of time. So I want to leave all of our viewers with a little something. This is something fun. I bet you may not have known about Australia. I didn't know, at least. Let's speak for myself. Google and Twitter will tell you where to find sausage sizzles this Australian election. Apparently it's an Australian thing. So I'll scroll down here and you can see. And so both of the two social media giants have places where you can go to see where your polling place is. Here's the Twitter version. Polling is the Twitter handle. And you see there, Jim here tweets polling box and a hot dog with a hot dog in it, a sausage. And Twitter will tell you where to go this weekend to place your vote and have a little sausage on the side. Of course, I want to get the very last word from our community who may be in Australia or elsewhere.
Sure, some from Australia. I'll leave you with a couple of comments here from Dawood, who is voting for the Green Party. He says because they're the only ones who act on what they believe is right, as opposed to following opinion polls, goes looking at you, liberal. I'm assuming that's a combination word for liberal and labor. And then we have Peter over here who says people want to know who's looking after them, not big business, trying to protect health and jobs, education, and giving a damn about Indigenous people.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
So much to think about when you go to the ballot box this weekend. We'll be watching. Thanks to all of our guests, Lewis, Amy, Mohammed, and Jonathan.